of the March Business Analysis Summit. Can you all hear me? Am I audible enough? Am I very audible? Okay, great. So, yeah, welcome to week 2 of Dobac's Business Analysis Summit. And for the past few weeks, not even few weeks, since this year started, since January, we've been having back-to-back sections, right? We've organized this summit because we are dedicated to helping business analysts grow and be a support system for them, and to ensure that there is this community where anyone who wants to, grow, develop as a business analyst, there's room for you. So we are invested in putting out resources and everything you need. So today we are going to be looking at a very interesting topic, and we have an amazing speaker who is going to be joining us today. We are going to be looking at crafting detailed business requirements documents. So we are trying to be strategic about the topics we are looking into, because we know we have people who are transitioning careers, we have people who are entry-level business analysts, and so we want to make our sessions very inclusive and make sure that it is valuable enough and it gives you the resources to grow. So today's session is not going to be like a regular session, right? But then get your Pepsi, get your popcorn. It's going to be really interesting. So with us here today, we have a very amazing and incredible guest with us. He was once IBAB of the Year finalist. That was in 2022, right? He's a thought leader in the BA space, and he's the host of the BA Insight series on LinkedIn and YouTube. So he's very experienced. He has the expertise and the knowledge to dish out what we want for today. So hi, John. Are you ready for us today?
I am. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's good to be on. Thanks for such a nice intro as well. Good to see you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So let's get to meet you. I know I didn't quite do justice to your intro. Let's get to meet you. Can you give us a brief intro of who you are? Yeah, so we get to meet you.
Brilliant. Yeah. So basically on top of what you said there, I work for a consultancy called Capco. We work in financial services based in London. We've got many offices around the world. I'm a managing principal, and I lead the BA and process chapter or capability. That means I'm often helping with, or actually leading the training from a business analysis perspective, leading on all things business analysis at Capco, I should say, working with key clients, helping them deliver projects as well. So I'm normally on projects myself in some form of BA related capacity. And when I'm not doing that, and I'm not looking after the Capco BA community, I also have my own YouTube channel, as Areshi said, called BA Insights. I think you can slightly see it over my right-hand shoulder picture. And it's just really a good opportunity for me to meet others in the BA community around the world and to talk about all things business analysis. And it's led to this opportunity here to talk to everyone, but it's also led to opportunities like being at the BA conference and being at BA Life and a few other events around the world as well. So it's been pretty good. So happy to be here.
Hopefully welcome. Yeah, welcome. I want to believe that with this brief intro, I'm sure that he did want to go deep into everything, right? But I want to believe that with this intro, we are all convinced that we have the right person in our midst to talk to us tonight. All right, so let's go into the topic for today. And our topic for today is crafting detailed business requirement documents. I know when people hear about it, it sounds so technical and so for aspiring and entry-level business analysts, they're like, what's this? If they are faced with it, they're like, how do they want to handle it? Now, for all your questions about it, we are going to be getting answers from them today. So, John, can you tell us what a business requirement document is? Let's get to know what it is. Let's start from the scratch. Let's get to know what a business requirement document is.
Yeah, so in a traditional waterfall project and some hybrid projects as well, we would use the business requirements document as one of the early artifacts as part of the analysis to really articulate what is the needs of the business. And I'm going to use the word business a lot in this question, because it really does just focus on business needs, business requirements, articulating, you know, the business situation and why the business needs such capability. You know, so what it isn't talking about the technology that a business need. It isn't talking about the detailed functional requirements. It's talking about those business type requirements. You know, so for example, the business might need greater transparency of their process. They might need to improve their process. They might need to have systems to help them automate the capture of information. You know, but you see all those examples that I was mentioning there, they're very reflective of like business situations that could apply across a number of scenarios and solutions. You know, and the business requirements document is that artifact that typically reflects those each individual business requirement as a collective. But it's worth mentioning that we don't always have to have a business requirements document to deliver business requirements. Sometimes we can actually capture business requirements in systems or in Excel or spreadsheets or in other forms. I guess probably the most important concept here is that there is a business requirement, but it is typically housed in that business requirements document, as you mentioned.
Okay, so that goes to say the business requirement document is more like a summarized version of the business requirement for the project, right?
Yeah, and I guess I wouldn't say summarized. I guess it's just a specific, I would use that word. So it's a specific set of specific requirements, really. I'm trying not to use the word requirement, but it's a specific articulation of what the business needs or what the business sees as its opportunities to improve.
Okay, so talking about the business requirement document, now what are the key characteristics of a well-crafted business requirement?
Okay, so the first thing to think about really is the fact that this business requirements document is there as a device to transfer business requirements from one person, i.e. the business and the business analyst, to the next level or the next stage in the project life cycle. So it's typically could be IT, it could be the functional analyst within IT, but it's really there to communicate to somebody what the requirements are. Okay, so we need to remember that because that's really key. Okay, so therefore the key characteristics of a well-written business requirements document is a document that is easily understood from individuals who are not necessarily experts on in the business themselves. And in fact, we tend to write these things directly so that it isn't just the expert that can understand it, it's actually anybody involved in that transformation or change, you know. And as I said, I mean, it's generally not a characteristic of that business requirements document is it articulates what the organization, the business need, what they see as their opportunities, how they might view as improvements that they require to some level, and it should explain why they need these things as well. Okay, it should typically not be too focused on the solution, as I mentioned, you know, unless there are those situations where actually the organization already have a solution, they're not intending on changing it, but they're talking more holistically about revising that solution in some high level way. Okay, but the key really is just business requirements are there to frame that detail and provide that context and help with the prioritization at a level so that it can facilitate further detail later on as we go into more detailed specifications, probably for each requirement.
So in essence, it should be clear enough for every stakeholder involved in the project so everyone can understand what they need, what the business needs from also the stakeholders' perspective. Yeah, that's
right. And quite a good acronym that we tend to use is something called SMART. I don't know if you've ever heard of this one, but each requirement we want to make sure is specific, is measurable, is achievable, realistic, and testable as well. You might sometimes hear smart and hear the T is time bound, but from a requirement perspective, the important thing here is testable.
Okay.
That can be quite a good way to think about, the characteristics of each requirement. They each have to be smart.
So that goes to say, if you are crafting a business requirement document, just the same way you try to make your business goals smart, right? That's the same way you do for the business requirement document. But this time around, we're not looking at it being time bound. We're looking at it being testable, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I want to believe that that's quite clear enough for each and every one of us. If you have questions as we go, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. We'll check from time to time and provide answers to your questions. All right, so now what are like the key attributes of well-defined business requirements?
Okay, so if we think about the attributes of a requirement, we're really talking about the different data points, the fields, if you like, that you capture for each one of these requirements that sit within the document, or maybe, as we've said already, might not sit within a document. Okay, so it's really made up, I guess, of the must-haves, really, in terms of the characteristics. So each individual business requirement should have a description, is the most important thing, arguably, because it describes what a business requirement is. It should have a unique identifier, because later on, I'm sure we might talk about, in fact, we might talk about traceability now, but we might end up talking about traceability again. So we need to have an identifier so that rather than have to keep describing the full requirement, we can refer to it as maybe business requirement number 1 or business requirement number 2. And that can be tied back to scope and other things that we might need to associate with our business requirement later on. It's also helpful because it's difficult to read, if you've got a number of business requirements, say 20 business requirements, it's not always easy to have to read the full descriptions each time to find the requirement you're looking for. And the identifiers don't always help unless you've given an identifier. So having a very concise and clear and understandable title is always helpful as well. I would say a priority is a must as well, so we can start to share a view of how important that requirement is. And there are a few ways that we tend to think about priorities and we reflect it, but generally we might, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the must-have or Moscow must-have, should have, could have, and won't have. So that is sometimes how we think about it. But I always think it's a lot more helpful just to say critical, high, medium, or low, because I think most people will recognize those 4 labels and be able to tell relatively what is more important out of that group. But we can also rank them as well if we really need to. So having that priority is really key, because what it means is the next or the consumer of those requirements, whether it's technology as an example or someone else, they can put their effort first into the highest priority requirements. So that's key. And I think one other attribute that I would say is also key is actually the rationale. Okay, because whilst we're capturing the need, i.e. the requirement and the description, whilst we're capturing the priority, knowing why is really important, and that rationale is really the why behind the requirement. And we'll talk a little bit later, I think, about user stories. So if we do, we'll talk about the correlation between perhaps some of the ways that a business requirement in traditional form is captured and a user story. So just to repeat, the key fields are the unique ID, the title, the description, the rationale, and the priority. But equally, there are additionally other information that might be useful to capture against each requirement is other associated references. So, for example, does a requirement only relate to specific items of scope? Does it only relate to certain business processes that you have defined already, current state? And maybe if you've defined use cases ahead of that, showing the reference to the business case would be another example. Okay, so showing that is useful. And I think last thing I can think of off the top of my head is really who raised the requirement. And it may be that many people raised the requirement. So that's important as well, because you may have questions later. You may have to go and clarify some more detail. So knowing who actually asked for a requirement is really key.
Okay. So if I got you right, you mentioned, like, I just want to like reiterate the points, right? So the description, right? Then the need, the scope, the rationale. What else am I missing?
So we've got the ID, we've got the title, we've got the description, we've got the priority, and the unique ID. I might have said that twice. They're the key. And then the secondary fields, I guess, would be it would be who raised the query, and any references to associate our requirement to our process or to our scope or to any other artifacts that we might be defining or looking at.
All right. So how does requirement documentation differ between agile and waterfall methodologies? Because I know there's a whole lot of agile, we hear a lot of agile methodologies, this perspective, right, of business analysis these days, but some companies still stick to waterfall methodology. So how does it differ? How does this requirement documentation differ between the agile and waterfall methodology?
Well, I guess, I mean, traditionally what would have happened, you would have in a traditional waterfall project, you have a set of requirements, and every requirement is analysed and defined up front. And then when everything's complete and your business requirements document is complete and it's been reviewed by the key stakeholders and signed off as finished, that is then when you hand that document over to perhaps technology or to the next role in the process, which might be a functional analyst, it might be technology, but it's not ready at that level to do any development on it, as it were. So that's a waterfall example. When it comes to an agile requirement or an agile process, we're not trying to capture every single requirement up front and then hand it over to the technical team. We're actually working a lot more collaboratively. But the technical team and the delivery team that are working on our requirements, they still need to know what it is the business needs. So we tend to use user stories or similar for agile. Doesn't mean we can't apply a user story for waterfall, but typically we'll capture business requirements and then functional requirements in a waterfall example. And when it comes to agile, we tend to capture maybe high-level stories to represent the high-level business need that may have more detailed user stories that are focused more on the functionality and features of a particular feature that we're building from the tooling or for the solution. Generally, we would tend to use tools like Jira, for example, for our user stories. They tend to be more focused, as I said, on product delivery as well. But otherwise, I mean, fundamentally, similar information is captured, because in a business requirement and an agile requirement, they still need to be prioritized. They still need to have a title. We still need to describe them. We still need to know, the relationship between our requirement and scope and process. So all that's still the same. When it comes to the rationale, that's sort of embedded in the description. The way we tend to write a user story includes the reason. Okay, so as an example, we might use I think it's called the cucumber terminology, right? So basically, as a certain type of user, so as a business analyst, I would like to capture my requirements automatically in order to, and that's the rationale. So in order to allow my stakeholders greater visibility of the requirements. So you see that structure there that we started talking about in terms of the agile user story, good structure is as we're going to specify the type of role that it applies to or stakeholder it might apply to. I would like, which is really specifying the need, in order to, which is basically specifying the rationale. Okay. So the similar information is there. It's just, I guess, the way we tend to write it, the tools we tend to use, is a little different. But fundamentally, you still have to understand what the business need, and you still have to communicate that to the team that are going to explore that need in more detail and possibly develop a solution for you.
Oh, okay. So, if I got you correct, can we say the major differences in the way the rationale is being written, since we use user stories for agile, right? So, can we say that?
Yes, we can say that. We can say we use agile stories for. Sorry, we can use user stories for agile. I think that's what you said there. Sorry,
Okay.
online.
Okay. Please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'll go through it and we'll provide answers to that. All right. So let's keep pushing. So how do we decide on the right format for documenting and presenting requirements?
Okay, so I mean, I guess at a high level, we've just talked about business requirements documents versus user stories. So if we use that as an example, how do we decide which is more appropriate? And there's actually many reasons, many drivers behind that decision. Really. So one of them is arguably the most important is the audience. Okay, so the audience that are going to receive that requirement, is there a methodology that is most compatible with the way they're working? So for example, if you've got a delivery team or a technology team who are already working in agile, it would be very inefficient to have them wait for you to complete a full business requirements document, then to deliver that requirements document, and then for that delivery team to translate each of them into a user story or similar, so they could then build off the back of it. It would be more appropriate in that example to just define user stories, perhaps use Jira or similar, and be agile yourself as the BA. The other consideration, though, when it comes to audience, isn't just the consumer; it's actually the business you're working with as well, because they need to be comfortable that what you're specifying is accurate and represents their full extent of their needs. So they need to be comfortable, whether it's reviewing a business requirements document, whether it's reviewing user stories, or some other form that you choose. You have to get that balance between, allowing your business to verify what you've specified and make sure it's complete and accurate, and your technology team or your implementation team or delivery team, they need to be able to consume that requirement in a most efficient, understandable, and effective way, I would say. Some other considerations at a very high level that can also influence which approach you use or format you might use could be the organization in which you work might already have standards or a center of excellence or a prescribed way of doing things. So that will help you decide maybe what is the right situation. Sometimes as well, it could just be based on the project type. So different types of projects, it might be more appropriate to work in an agile way with user stories than it might in another. So for example, if there's a situation where the business have very limited time to spend with the analyst and it's only going to be available up front, maybe that would suggest that a business requirements document might be more appropriate in the first instance. Whereas if you were trying to present requirements for a new screen or a report, that feels like you'd want to do a mock-up or a wireframe of some description of what that could look like. So maybe the user stories might be a bit more compatible with that scenario. And I think the last criteria that can define the approach we take is really the experience and the preference of the team as well.
Mm-hmm.
So not one size fits all answer, I'm afraid, but a few variations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in more summarized, how would I put it? In summary, we can say you have to consider the organizational standards, the project you're working on, the project timeline, your stakeholders involved, because they have to be able to understand whatever it is you're passing across to them, and the business needs. Yeah,
that's it.
right.
Absolutely. So it shows how adaptable you have to be as a business analyst. You can't just have one prescribed way of doing everything. You need to be able to mold your approach based on who you're working with.
Okay. I want to believe that that's clear enough, right? Okay, so how do we ensure that the business requirements are specific, clear, and actionable?
Okay, so I mentioned SMART earlier, so that's a good way to start. You know, as you capture a requirement, before you pass it to anybody else, have a look at it and make sure that you are defining a specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and testable requirement. I think the process of reviewing your requirement yourself as well can't be underplayed. It's so important, actually, that when you write each requirement, that you read it several times to make sure, does it really describe what you want, you know, your message, as it were. And if you read it, can you honestly say there's no obvious way that it will be misinterpreted? And if you think it could be misinterpreted, that's a really good time for you to adjust your requirement to make sure, as much as you can, that requirement is going to be received in the right way, I would say. So reviewing the requirement quite often yourself is essential, right? And the best way to review it yourself is to try and look at it as if you weren't the person who wrote the requirement. Try and put yourself in the shoes of the person who's going to read it. So put yourself in the shoes of the business that you're working with. Put yourself in the shoes of the development team or the technical team that you're working with. Put yourself in the shoes of the functional BA, perhaps, who might be taking these requirements and turning them into a functional specification. You know, but if you put yourself in these different shoes and think about how you would receive that requirement, it's a really good way to make sure you've given it your best in terms of capturing it accurately. The good news is that you don't have to just rely on that. Okay, so once you've done as well as you can to just make sure you've captured what you believe to be an accurate and relevant and complete requirement, then you can review it and should review it with your stakeholder. So the stakeholder that asked for the requirement in the first place, play it back to them. You know, let them see how you've interpreted their words, and that's a good opportunity for them to correct you if there's any slight differences in the way you understood things. And sometimes just the fact of you writing it down gives them the chance to look at maybe there's additional information they might want to share or additional requirements they want to share. So it's really good practice, and it helps build up trust, helps build your relationship, so it's positive on every level. Beyond that, there are other ways to improve the requirement as well, and that is, you know, peer reviews. So ask your colleagues to review the requirement and give you feedback as to whether they think that requirement appears to be, you know, ambiguous, unclear, maybe irrelevant to the scope, you know, impossible even, if they look at it, and does it have all the attributes that we've just spoken about? And I think beyond that, you know, beyond that informal peer reviews that I just mentioned, then finally we would typically go through formal reviews as well with our stakeholders. So we would give them that finalized business requirements document or set of requirements if we're doing it slightly differently, and we would ask them to review the requirements and hopefully give a sign off. Okay. And this is really important as well when we think if we're providing somebody with a document and we're asking them to review it and tell us if it's accurate. We've got to realize they're probably that is their day job is probably not to review your document. They are probably already doing a full day's work and their focus is elsewhere. So we should try and make the documents we give them as easy to read and navigate as possible. You know, so we're not trying to drown them in text. We're trying to give them as concise, easy to digest document as we can. We want them to find what we need them to find. You know, and that could even go to the example if you've got 5 different people reviewing your requirements and they each need to sign off a different section. Keep the sections separate. Make it clear that one person only has to review 1/5 of the requirements in my example. You know, you just want to make their life easy so that they can actually do the review rather than decide to ignore it, which you definitely don't want.
So in essence, for your business requirement to be specific, clear, and actionable, the keyword there is review, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So when you're looking at running the review through the stakeholders and your peers, which one would you say would come first? So as a business analyst, after writing your business requirement and on your own, you have reviewed it, and for you, you feel like, oh, this is good to go. So would you say the next step is to review with stakeholders first or to review with the peers first?
I would review it informally with my stakeholders or a limited stakeholder if I need to. I don't always need to, but that will be the first step before a peer review. Because if an example, Amarachi, if you were the person giving me the requirement and you verbally share that requirement with me, I could decide to document it and not let you see it and hand it over to somebody else to look at. But it would be far easier before I share it to anyone, just to share it back with you and say, does this reflect what you said and what you need? And it's really easy to do that. I think it'll be a good way for you to go, okay, John he actually cares about the requirement in that sense. So when you've given me your blessing that the requirement is basically saying what it needs to say, that's a good time then for me to ask my peers to check it to make sure who's going to consume it next can understand it. Yeah, because you're in that example, your role as the business stakeholder would just be to make sure that your need is specified. You're not necessarily going to review it to make sure it's going to be interpreted in the right way. Whereas as a BA, we need to make sure our documents are interpreted in the way that they're meant.
All right, so let's just take a few minutes break and ask the house. Do we have any questions so far? You can raise your hands and let's have your questions. Any questions so far? Do we have questions? Because I can't see anything in the chat box, and that means John is actually doing a good job. Okay, we have something. So Cynthia is asking, would the review be assumed or addressed as validate? I think this is not so clear, right? Cynthia, can you probably unmute and she left. Where did she go? Okay.
I guess you're saying there, it feels like that Cynthia is saying that would we assume that once the review has been completed, that if we don't hear back, that we can assume it's correct and accurate?
Oh, okay.
That's where I'm interpreting that, to be honest, that comment.
Yeah.
If I'm right, Cynthia, then I would say what we need to do in that case is to get explicit confirmation that the requirement is valid. Because if we don't hear anything back from the stakeholder, it might just mean they haven't seen the requirement. We can't assume it means it's accurate.
Okay, I think she wrote validation of a requirement. So I think you answered the question, if that's what she's saying. All right, yeah, we answered the question correctly. So do we have any more questions? Please feel free to ask. We're here for you. That's the reason we're here tonight. So if you have a question, please drop them. Okay, BB, you can unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. Hi, John. Thank you. My question is for the business requirement, because I was trying to understand how to actually write a business requirement from all you have said, but I still struggle to understand how that business requirement is being done. Okay. I don't know. Yeah. So that's my question.
Yeah, and I guess it's difficult to give you an exact example, but maybe the way to think about it is, you might be given quite a lot of information and you need to digest that information and essentially distill it into a concise statement, so you really just need to be able to specify what it is the business need and why they need it. Really, they might give you a load of information around what has led to this need. They might give you information about, what they perceive to be the solution. They might give you information that is really in the in the context of the requirement isn't necessary. So you have to find a way to move that to the side and just take the core words. What is it they really need? And it isn't something that you have to worry about getting perfect straight away. So even if you just capture what you believe to be the pertinent points that they shared with you, and you're not sure, that's a really good time to share it back with your stakeholder and ask them, have you interpreted the key message in terms of the requirement correctly? And you can certainly say to them, yeah, I think that's probably it. That's probably good enough with Vera. You're speaking longer.
Hi, Vivi. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right,
Thank you
great.
so much.
You're welcome. We have Peter. Peter is asking, is BRD compulsory in an agile environment? Had a debate around it recently. I am pro BRD though. All right, so he's asking if it's compulsory in an agile environment.
Well, typically in an agile environment, you wouldn't see a business requirement document at all. You would see user stories. You might see high-level user stories. You might see epics above that, but we won't confuse things on that. So in a really agile project, you are unlikely to see a BRD. And the reason for that is a BRD promotes that activity of spending a lot of time up front to gather all the requirements before you let the next participant have a look at it, i.e. before you let technology look at the requirements. However, sometimes there are situations where it's appropriate to write a BRD up front and give it to technology. And those situations generally are when the business are not able to collaborate all the way through the change process. Maybe they're only having a certain amount of time. So if that's the case, it might make sense to capture a BRD to hold their requirements in the first instance. But if you're pro BRD, I would say, just think you're probably pro the business requirements within the BRD, I would imagine. So just so that same mentality, those same requirements that are accurate, you're just going to deliver them in a slightly different way.
Hi, Peter. I hope this answers your question. You can drop it in the chat so we know that you are good to go. So, Anda is asking if BA career is all about documentation. Actually, not when I said that.
No, it's definitely not. But in fairness, without documenting your analysis, your findings, the views that you've covered, it's going to be difficult for anyone to not only understand it, but actually to do something with it. So for example, if Emma actually shared her requirements with me and I just remembered it and I was able to give it to Peter, if I take Peter as an example, right? If I was able to verbally tell Peter all the requirements, then it makes it all about Peter trying to remember everything I told him. And that's really unfair, so we need to find a way to make sure that everybody can digest the information that I have, and the way that we can do that is to document the information I have and show where it came from and make it as easy for people to understand it.
All right. And I can see your hands up. Is it still related to the question?
Yes, I just want to sorry about that, but I just wanted to follow up on that, because if like you're someone who doesn't necessarily like to write too much, will it be a disadvantage if you wanna transition to be a BA, or is it something that you can? Is it a skill that you can maybe learn?
It's definitely a skill you can learn. So I would say it's a skill not to avoid it. It's a skill to develop and learn. Okay, because if you become a BA, you're going to have loads of opportunities to learn loads and loads of new skills, ways of working, and a lot of them are really good. And you can actually, most of them you can use in your personal life as well. They become quite useful. So writing is just another example of that, really. And I think it would be the benefit of the BA as well as the audience if you learn to write the requirements. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to go and figure it out all by yourself. It means you have to try, and then you use your colleagues and your team, you ask through peer reviews or sessions like this, you learn how to evolve your requirements so they get better. You know, I can certainly say when I first started, I'm pretty confident my requirements were not very good. Okay, if there was a way for me to keep hold of a version of my requirements from when I first started and compare them now, I'd probably be quite shocked. Okay, so don't let that stop you. You know, as long as you've got an open mind and you're willing to learn and get better, that's the main thing, really. But definitely, you can't avoid documentation.
All right. Cynthia, I can see your hands up. You want to say something? You have a question?
Yeah. Good evening, John. Good evening, everyone on call. Thank you so much for that initial question. The second one has to do with what I've already said on the chat, but because I've had the privilege to ask, I will try to leverage it. I understand some teams and organizations work hybrid. That is to say, they make use of agile to some point and then waterfall. I think especially on the area of documentation. So now that we know ordinarily, according to Babok and what you've just shared with us, that agile is not necessarily for documenting. We know that according to Agile Manifesto, but how best? Because at the end of the day, you're required to have documentation. And sometimes when things go wide, they will be required to like trace where is the problem from, where is this challenges coming from. If you don't have document to prove to know where to trace it, how then do you manage it? So my question will now be, what will be the best technique or a way to document an agile environment? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think maybe a misconception sometimes of agile is that you don't have to document. You do, but you know, you don't necessarily have the same type of documents as we've already heard. But you still need to capture the information. You know, you do it in a different order, in a different format, perhaps, but you definitely need to capture the information. You know, so as an example, you know, in Agile, it might be that you're, along with the development team, you might be involved in conversations with the business, and they will share verbally what they need. But in order to make sure that that information they've shared doesn't go to waste, you will be the person that has to capture that information. And it's always good practice to give that requirement back to the person who raised it to make sure it is accurate in terms of what they need. You know, and whilst it's a case that we hope our requirement won't sit on the shelf for weeks and months before someone looks at it, it'll probably be a matter of days or hours or even weeks at worst case. It's still unlikely that the individual in the development team or the technology team is going to remember the specifics of that conversation enough to be able to develop a solution. So they're still going to rely on some documentation. So that's, I guess we should dispel that myth, I suppose, that there's no documentation in Agile. Your question as well, you mentioned about some teams working in hybrid, and there's basically two forms of hybrid. There's unacceptable and acceptable. Let's keep it that simple, right? So the unacceptable hybrid would be that you do all of the same steps that you would do in a waterfall project. So for example, you capture a full business requirement specification. You then, when you finish that, then you do functional specification as well. When you finish that, that's the first time you give it to technology, right? And then technology take those documents and they create business user stories, and then they develop those user stories in an agile way. You're elongating the process very unnecessarily, right, for no benefit. So that will be an unacceptable hybrid. But an acceptable hybrid would be like that situation I mentioned earlier, where if the business are not able to collaborate all the way through, and therefore they can't, you need to gather the information from them. Maybe you could at least spend some time up front capturing their high-level requirements or initial view of their requirements. And what better to put them in initially than a business requirements document, so you can share it back with the business to make sure that you've understood everything that they've asked for. And then you can take those business requirements, and then you can start to turn them into functional user stories that the development team start to work on. So that acceptable hybrid where you do the BRD and then it goes into agile delivery is okay in the right situations. What wouldn't be okay is if you do a waterfall BRD, a waterfall functional specification, and then user stories, because that would just be creating additional artifacts for no value.
So Cynthia, I want to believe that answers your question, yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much, John. And in addition, can I ask one more?
All right.
All right. So
We have to push ahead and then it's
yeah,
fine.
sorry about that. Now, because sometimes we try to know if there's a shortcut to certain things. So can you share some of the documents a BA is required to document in agile environment? Thank you.
So what I will say is I'm going to answer the question a little differently. Okay. So I won't talk about documents, but I'll talk about information. Okay. So whether you're in agile or whether you're in waterfall, you will naturally need to understand the business process. You will naturally need to understand the high-level business requirements. You will naturally need to document and understand who your stakeholders are. You will naturally need to, potentially, if you're working to that level, you'll naturally need to think about the functional requirements or the needs of the features, basically, what the features need to be for the tool. If you're working on something visual, like a report or a screen, you might need to create wireframes or mock-ups of what that screen might look like. You might, if you explore some complicated functional requirements or features, you might need to explore that functionality in some models as well. So these are all things that are relevant to both waterfall and agile. The only difference would be is in waterfall, you would tend to use them all in in chunks all together, whereas in waterfall you would use them all at once and then hand your analysis over. Whereas in waterfall, you tend to apply these techniques in an iterative manner, collaboratively all the way through the project. So don't think of it as documents. Think of it more as like those artifacts or techniques that you're applying.
Cynthia, I think we are done here.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Abiodun, I saw your hands up. Let's take that as the last question, then we'll move ahead. Can you ask
good
your
evening.
question?
Good evening, everyone. I think some of the questions I wanted to ask, Cynthia already.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
Great. That's good.
Thank you.
All right. So let's forge ahead. All right. So what techniques do you use to elicit business requirements effectively from stakeholders?
Okay. So by elicit requirements, for anyone that's not clear on that, I always use that term, but some people aren't always clear. It just means gather requirements, basically. So to gather requirements, I guess the most basic and probably effective for most times are one-to-one meetings, between you and your stakeholder, or workshops where you meet a group of stakeholders in one situation. Okay, so they're probably the most typical ways, and they each have their advantages. So, for example, sometimes it's definitely good to speak to, if you've got loads of stakeholders or a lot of stakeholders, speaking to them in a workshop gives you the opportunity to hear their perspectives at once, and they get to feed off of what each other is saying. Okay, but sometimes as a BA, you're not familiar with the business context or the process or the terminology. So if that's the case, throwing yourself in to lead a workshop where loads of people, where everyone else is an expert, and you're hearing terms for the first time, and you're expected to understand them, and you're expected to document them, I think is a little bit too much, right? So what I would do is I would have some one-to-one meetings first with some of my stakeholders, just to understand the key terminology, get a bit of background and context, have a few examples of what those stakeholders might need, and then if it's appropriate, then I would have a workshop to explore those requirements, but then expand on them and take different perspectives as well. You notice I'm saying the word perspective a lot, and that's really important because, I know I'm going to say that a lot today, I always do, right? In that, if you have one-to-one meetings, you still need to get different perspectives from different types of individual, so people that have a role to play in the process, at different stages of the process, that maybe have different responsibilities in the process, so for example, if you speak to a manager in the payments team, you speak to someone who is a payments clerk or a payments administrator, they might have different information for you and different requirements. Maybe if they're reacting to payments request from the business team, then you should speak to someone in the business as well to get their perspective. So it's important to speak to the representatives from each group that are going to provide a holistic set of requirements. And sometimes bringing them all together in a workshop is really effective, and sometimes it's very difficult. There's no perfect answer on that. Sometimes it just depends on the number of stakeholders, the topic, how familiar you are with the content, how able you are to consume the information that they're giving you all at once. So there are a couple of techniques. I think other techniques you can use as well to gather information is you can observe stakeholders, so you can sit with one of them or some of them and watch what they're doing, ask questions, or you can ask them to carry out their daily task, but tell you what they're doing. And as they tell you, they should also tell you what they need or what's not working well or what could be improved. Okay. Likewise, as I said, I think I said earlier, if you were working on something visual, like you were responsible for the requirements relating to a report or a screen, okay, I would actually start with a prototype. So I would try and work with, at first, a small number of stakeholders to just build a view of what that report or screen might look like, okay, and all it is just boxes, right? I would just draw a box to represent the screen or a report, and put boxes on to say this has to have customer information. There's a box there for transaction information. There's a box for payment information, etc. Okay, and then with that view of the different types of information that appears on your report, then you can use that to start to explore in more detail. So, for example, where does my customer data come from? What type of information about the customer should I display? Am I displaying information about one customer at a time? Can I change the information about the customer if it's wrong? And you just explore it in that way until you and the stakeholders feel like they've shared everything about their needs, and you've captured everything about those needs as well. So again, it's not one perfect answer, but as a BA, having a number of different ways that you can approach the situation is useful. And because sometimes it's just driven by an individual. I'll give you one more example. It could be that you're in a workshop, and we've all seen this before. One person is very quiet all the way through the workshop, maybe doesn't say a word at all. Okay, you can't guarantee that person who's really quiet isn't the most important person in terms of information. Maybe they've got all of the really good knowledge. So if that's the case, you need to find a way to get that knowledge from that person. So maybe they're not very good in a workshop because they feel shy, perhaps, right? So for them, maybe you having a one-to-one conversation with them would be easier. But you definitely need to find a way to get the perspectives from all your stakeholders, or all representative stakeholders anyway.
Thank you. So, how do we now handle situations where we have stakeholders provide vague or conflicting requirements?
I guess when it's vague, I think the first thing is just you being open enough to recognize when it's not clear, the requirement's not clear, and challenging your stakeholder. So asking them questions, ask them more information. So a good question to ask sometimes is why. Why do you need that? Why is that a requirement? What are you going to do with that solution, or who is going to use it? Simple questions most of the time. But by asking those simple questions, it's a way to, I guess, explore really that vague requirement and get more detail on it. sometimes, as you mentioned, you don't just get vague requirements, you might get conflicting requirements as well. And I guess if we're talking about vague, I guess we were talking about conflicting requirements, we should probably talk about those requirements that are also not conflicting, right? To give it some context. So if I asked everyone in this room for their requirements about a given topic, if there were a load of things you were telling me that was all generally the same, right, I could feel pretty comfortable that requirement is accurate. But if there were some elements of requirements where there was that conflict, you would seemingly one person was asking for something that seemed quite different than someone else, then the best way to approach that is to get those 2 individuals or 3 individuals, however many it is, and get them together and just explore it in a bit more detail. Because the reason why there's sometimes conflicting requirements, most of the time, in my opinion, is because the BA doesn't necessarily understand all of the detail, because you can't, you have to learn it. So if you've got 2 stakeholders giving you information that you've not heard of before, and they're using terminology you're not very familiar with, and they're stakeholders you don't know their style, you could interpret the same information in a slightly different way from 2 conversations. So maybe the reason for the conflict is your misunderstanding with the 2 stakeholders, or it could, of course, be they're asking for different things. But if you bring them together with you and you talk about it, it will be very evident quickly where the misunderstanding lies. Okay, and if it is a conflicting requirement, like it really is 2 stakeholders who just have polar views of what is necessary, there are a few approaches you can take. So if those stakeholders have different views, but really only maybe one of them has a view, and actually they're the person using the solution that they're talking about, okay, perhaps their view you could see is more important than the view of someone who is not really using the tool, they're just observing, they just have an opinion. Okay, so that is a way sometimes of thinking, what is someone's perspective, is it as valid as someone else's perspective? And it's not always easy. This question is one of those that I feel like I could probably spend 2 or 3 hours answering and still not have answered it fully. But there are just a couple of ways, I think, to help with conflict. Oh, actually, sorry, there is one other way as well. All right. So sometimes if you've got conflicting requirements from different stakeholders, take a step back and think about what the organization might want. Okay. So what's the best interest of the organization you work with, if it's possible? And if you can think like that, and if you can identify that one of the requirements is would be more beneficial to the organization, maybe that's a way to resolve your conflict, and explain it in that way, I would say as well.
Okay, so let's say we have stakeholders who have the same authority level when it comes to the project, right? And they have conflicting requirements. So are you suggesting that if they insist on their stance, the BA can just go ahead to work with what aligns best for the business?
I wouldn't just jump to that. I think it's an evolution. So the first thing is bring them together, try and resolve the conflict, and then just be open and say, look, if we're not going to resolve this conflict, we should take a view of what's in the benefits of the organization. And maybe the way you do that is you have to involve more stakeholders to get their opinions. So in that example, in fact, that's probably the practical advice, right? Because it's probably quite difficult for most people to have to be able to take the view of what might be best for the organization. Maybe what you need to do then is speak to more stakeholders and find out where the support might be. And you might find that that one person had a conflict. Actually, everyone else is saying something different. But I would still but one person that had a different view, I wouldn't dismiss their view. We should still be telling them and speaking to them and working with them and letting them know that their view is still important. But on this occasion, because the overriding population have a different requirement, you will, and if the data supports the main group as well, I'm not sure what more you could do as the BA.
Yeah.
There is a point where you realise, I'm not sure there's much more we can do. But the positive thing is, what I've explained to you, the process of bringing stakeholders together, trying to get data to back up your position, even using the process to figure out who has a more appropriate perspective, taking the organisational view. That's generally quite successful. I mean, if I say generally, it is successful. So I've not had a situation where I've gone through all those steps and I've still got stakeholders who can't agree. I've never had that, you know.
Personally, I feel like it's easier to handle situations where you're provided with vague requirements than conflicting requirements. And I have probably a lot of people still have questions about that. Just you can put them down in the chat. We'll come back to that later. Let's move forward. All right. So what tools do you use in documenting and managing business requirements?
Sorry, could you repeat that again, please, Rashi?
So I'm asking, like, what tools do we use as BA
The
for
line
documenting?
So whilst it's not ideal, just using Word or Excel is a good start, you know. So if you don't have any tools that are dedicated to requirements, it is perfectly fine to capture requirements in Excel or Word, as long as you capture all of those key attributes that we spoke about earlier, like the ID and the title, etc. Right? And in fact, sometimes a spreadsheet is quite easy for the BA to use, right? It's quite quick for them to change things around. The trouble with that is that if you've got a spreadsheet, it's not always easy to share that information and for others to collaborate with it. It can be done, but it's not as easy. And it's and you run the risk that you could delete the file and then you lose all of your requirements at once. You know, again, it's not likely, but it can happen. So probably more desirable than using Word or Excel would be a tool. And you know, it could be something like Confluence or using SharePoint to put your documents onto. That's a helpful first start. There are also dedicated requirements tools like Jammer, Jira, Azure DevOps. There's others I don't even know. There's plenty I don't know about, but there'll be dedicated requirements tools. I think as well, you know, in terms of tools, we've spoken about tools that are more around recording the requirements. So you record a requirement in Word, you record it in Excel, you capture it in Jira as an example. But you can also use tools for other purposes. So you could use a tool to help you with your requirements in terms of review it with you and suggest the changes. Yeah. So for example, you could use ChatGPT. You know, that would be a tool that would be beneficial in helping you review your requirement and maybe consider your requirement from a different perspective. I wouldn't say rely on it 100%. Don't rely on it, but it can be a useful tool, and there are definitely others. Definitely others.
Okay, so for starters, you can start out with Excel. You can start out with documents. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. The key thing is just finding out what your organisation are using, find out what your stakeholders would prefer, find out what technology you're already using, and use that as a basis to decide. And if there is no preference, maybe the business don't have a preference. If technology don't have a preference, then it comes down to what you and the business analysis team feel like is most appropriate for you to be able to do your work and to collaborate together.
Okay, yeah. That answers that. All right. So what are some of the common mistakes business analysts make when crafting requirements, and how can we avoid them?
I think some of the key mistakes, or probably the biggest mistake, is not listening to your stakeholders. So when they're telling you their requirements, your role is to listen, right? And I think I would say the biggest skill that we would have is communication skill. Okay. But I would say 80, 90, 95% of that communication skill should be listening. Okay. So one of your viewers a moment ago just said about, they don't like writing requirements. The positive is that, when it comes to communication, you should be putting a lot of emphasis on the listening part. Okay. So if you don't listen and you don't take an interest in what your stakeholders are saying, that is the biggest mistake. And it sounds really weird to say it. It sounds strange to say that we wouldn't listen, but unfortunately, there are situations where that does occur. You know, and that is the root, the absolute root cause of poor requirements, I would say. But beyond that, I think other mistakes that can be made is not being aware of the scope. Okay, so it's fine to talk about more than the scope, but if you're not aware of it, you're not going to be able to reflect the requirements that are in scope versus those that are out. Okay, I think sometimes as well we can be too verbose with our writing. You know, so the best business analysts are communicating the same information in as fewer words as possible so that the audience can digest it. Okay, so we don't get paid as business analysts by the word, so therefore there's no benefit in creating a massive document. You know, in fact, the opposite. You know, it's perfectly fine for you to spend a lot of time doing analysis but produce a very small document if it says everything you need to say. You know, so I think yeah, and that does go back to, I guess, considering your audience as well, right? Because you have to consider they need to read the stuff you're producing, so make it easy for them. Don't drown them in data.
Yeah. So as a business analyst, you should work towards upskilling or brushing up your communication skills. It's like one of the most important skills a business analyst should have. And as much as
the most.
Yeah, and as much as possible, we should try making our documents concise, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
All right. Okay, so how do we bridge the gap between business users and developers when translating requirements?
I mean, really, it's a case of trying to understand what the business need, but also understanding what technology need from you as well. You know, so a good technique that I've developed, I mean, it's not developed, I just use it, is that I will speak to the technology team as well as the business. Ask technology, what do they need from me as the business analyst? What has worked well for them before? You know, what have they had from other BAs that is valuable, and would they like to repeat? But also, what do they get from BAs that they don't use and they don't like and they don't find it useful? You know, and would they like to change? That they would like to change. So that's really quite an important thing to help bridge that gap. You know, because if you know what technology you need, you can ask the business the right question to give technology what they need. In that example, sometimes as well, just knowing that, you know, you don't have to be you might be you might help facilitate the conversation between the business and technology, but you don't have to keep them separate. You can bring these two groups together and you can help them collaborate, you know, and then and that way technology could ask their questions if there's something that is easier to get them to ask, and the business can tell technology the answers. But as we said earlier, the BA has to then document the outcomes of that, because we don't want those outcomes to be lost. Yeah. And I think one other thing I would share is actually just going layer by layer. All right, so try not to drown your audience, giving the technology team like processes, requirements, models, spreadsheets all at once, right? Maybe it's easier for them to digest if you give them some context, give them some high-level requirements, give them some process, give them some models, give them some detailed requirements, give them some prototypes. Whatever way you do it, just bit by bit, logically in order. I think that can sometimes help.
Okay. All right. So please, if you have questions regarding this, please drop them in the chat box and we'll go through them. All right. So how do we measure the quality and effectiveness of business requirements?
I mean, fundamentally, the effectiveness of the business requirements, the biggest measure is actually how well they've been interpreted by by the team that are going to take them on, right? So if it's a functional analyst within IT, for example, if they have fully understood your requirement, that is the biggest measure of the requirement itself. Now, it isn't always easy to measure that unless, of course, you're getting loads and loads of questions, or every time you send a requirement to technology, they send it back because you're missing key attributes, or it's not very clear. That would be a good way to show it isn't effective, as an example. Yeah, it's as much about data, but I mean, maybe the ultimate test is if you've got defects within your solution, and those defects can be directly attributed to the way that your requirements were written, that again would be a way to measure or reflect that your requirements aren't so good. But the opposite is also true, right? So that if there are no errors or no defects being spotted during testing that are associated to the quality of the requirement, that would be a good measure of how effective the requirement has been. Okay. Also, maybe peer reviews are a measure of the quality. So not necessarily the number of peer reviews or reviews themselves, but actually from the reviews, how much feedback was there, and how has it been actioned correctly or fully? Because if it has been fully actioned, that would suggest you're improving the requirement. Okay. Yeah, so there's a few ways to measure, and maybe actually as well, are we using the prescribed tools or templates as well? That would be another way to think about it. But ultimately, with BAs, don't just BAs are not successful if they deliver good requirements and technology develop them poorly. BAs are only successful if the requirements are developed successfully and implemented successfully, and the business used them. So that's the way we should think about the benefit of our requirements. They're only good if the solution's good. So we have to help everyone get to a good solution.
Right. So essentially, it should be testable, right? Like it should pass the testing stage.
It should, yeah. And you need to, I guess, to pass the testing stage, you need to think about how the user is going to interact with the solution and what that you've been asking for. Yeah. That's just taking that responsibility, I guess.
Okay. All right. So have you ever used AI automation tools to assist with requirement gathering or documentation? If so, how effective were they?
So I mean, we've used it in different ways at different times. So, for example, like gathering requirements. Whilst I don't have AI gather the requirements on my behalf, I've been fortunate enough to use some tools or see some tools where we would record the session and play that session through AI to see has AI interpreted the requirement in the same way the business analyst has. And that's quite a useful way to just make sure that at the end of the process, if you come out of a meeting, you record the session, you play it through AI, you've got your notes. If your notes are complemented by what's AI producing, and AI is telling you additional things that are valuable, then that's really useful. I think as well, once you've documented a requirement, tools like Gen AI, ChatGPT, etc., are very useful in terms of being able to review a requirement to tell you, does this feel like this could be ambiguous? Could you improve it in any way? It's not to replace your reviews with the stakeholder. Just think of it as another type of stakeholder. Okay, so if you have access to ChatGPT as an example, or Copilot perhaps, or similar, Claude, whatever systems you might have access to, treat it like another stakeholder and see if you can play those requirements into, say, ChatGPT and ask, could it be improved? But don't, I guess my big advice would be, just make sure you're checking what you're getting from it. You can't rely on what you're receiving from AI in the same way that you can't rely on everything you're told from an individual. Generally, if we speak to an individual, we only can take what they're telling us as true if we speak to many individuals and they all say the same thing, or if the data backs it up. So it's the same with AI. We can only really assume it's accurate when we've got enough perspectives to know what we're getting is accurate. But that's how I use it anyway.
Thank you so much, John. You've actually done justice to my questions. And at this junction, I think I'll have to throw open the house and ask if anyone have questions to ask. This is the right time for you to ask all your questions. I think we have a bit of time to answer them. So you can drop them in the chat box or raise your hands and I would call you and you ask your questions. So the floor is open, guys. Any questions? All right, Vincent, you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for this session. And I will head straight to my question. John, can you please, in your experience, and I know you probably would have, if not first-hand experience, if not, from your level of business analysis world, let me put it that way. Can you say precisely there is one particular? Now, I'm not talking about the process. I'm not talking about the strategy or framework. Can you say specifically there is one document that probably will relate to business analysis when we talk about documentation, one unique document that you think you can relate to every area of business analysis, irrespective of the should I say, be it engineering, be it accounting, I mean finance, be it something like that. If that's straight enough. Thank you.
I mean, for me, probably everyone will have a slightly different answer, but for me, I'm going to give you two, Vincent, okay? Because I think it's probably important. The two I've got are so closely related. It'd be probably best. So for me, like this stakeholder matrix or RACI is really key document, because I need to reflect who I'm speaking to, why, who's contributed to the requirements, because all of your analysis that you deliver, you need to be able to justify that you haven't just made it up. Now, obviously, we don't make it up, but having that view of all your stakeholders that have been involved is a good way of showing how comprehensive your analysis is and how credible your analysis is. But it's also more important than that. It's a really good way of organising yourself as you go through your analysis process. So stakeholder RACI matrix is one of my number ones. And my other number one is business process, because you need to know the current state process, because that will help contextualize the stakeholders you're speaking to, the activities they're doing, the reasons they have requirements, why they need solutions, what we tie that to scope. It's so important to know what the business process is. So they're my two, Vincent, I would say.
Right. So Vincent, does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you so much. That's a good one. Thank you.
All right. To add to it, if you're hearing RESI metrics for the first time or you want to understand what it's all about, I think we had a session last month with Tia, where she broke down how to use the RESI metrics. So you can check our library for it, and it's there. You would learn a lot from that. All right. Do we have more questions, please? If you have a question, this is like the best time to ask. You can always reach out to John on LinkedIn and he would answer you. But I think now he's in the mood of answering business requirements questions. So this is the best time to drop your question and get your answer. So
I'm going to share a link as well, if I may. Hopefully we can share it afterwards, but you might get some answers on some of the sessions that I've had before. So I've had I speak about requirements. There's a couple of sessions I've had on the topic as well about eliciting requirements or defining requirements. So you might find some useful information there as well.
Yeah. For those who did not join us earlier, John is a host for Business Analyst Insights on YouTube. You can go and check out his channel. He has a lot of information for BAs. And also, if you're someone who likes to listen to music or something audio, you can check out BA Insight podcast on Spotify. And you would learn a lot from. In fact, he's been into this business analysis since for over 2 decades now. So that should tell you that you have a lot to learn from him. Just check him out. Yeah. You can also drop your LinkedIn profile link in the chat, so those who want to follow can follow. You can ask your questions and reach out. He's very approachable. You can get across to him on LinkedIn. All right, so still waiting. Do we have questions? John, it seems we actually did a very good job by answering all the questions and explaining things clearly. Because yeah, there are no questions from the chat box. Nobody's raising hands, so I think it's safe to say that we are good to go.
Okay.
Right. It's safe to say that we are good to go. So thank you so much for this session. We appreciate you. And we hope that when we call on you next time, you would also answer us. So yeah. And if you're yet to watch our session, you probably didn't join in early, you can check our library. The session is recorded, you have access to it, and the library is accessible to just members of the community. So if you're probably just joining from LinkedIn and you don't have you're not a member of our community, you should do well to register. That's how you get access to this session and other impactful session we've had and the ones we're yet to have. We still have a session next week and next 2 weeks, and trust me, it's something you don't want to miss. Right. So I think that's for today. Thank you so much, John. Once again, we appreciate you. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the call. And I want to believe you got value for your time. And we are committed to dishing out value from time to time. All right. At this junction, I would call it a wrap.
Okay. Thank you.
See you all next week. See you all next week. Bye.